Hi students, in this video that we're going to cover most of the remaining material of the course, and we're going to be looking at how Communist China, the People's Republic of China, interacts with other countries both within Asia and European and American countries. So we're looking back at that theme of Asian countries interacting with outsiders, Asian countries interacting with Western outsiders. Um, the People's Republic of China's foreign policy first sees the rise of tensions with the Soviets. Remember, the Soviets had provided Chinese communists with the weaponry at the end of the Second World War that they needed to defeat the nationalists. However, the Soviets do not trust the Chinese enough to give them the science behind atomic weapons. They also support Tibet becoming independent of China. And so Chinese communists are going to be increasingly at odds with their Soviet Russian counterparts. Mao also resents Khrushchev's efforts to distance himself from Stalin and what he sees as a lack of Russian determination to defeat the United States in the Cold War. Tensions become so heated, in fact, that in 1968 and into 1969 there is a brief border war. Shooting breaks out in northern China on the frontier between China and Russia. There was real fear on the part of the Chinese that if the Russians were able to penetrate the frontier, the flat Chinese land would mean that Russian tanks could roll right through China and reach Beijing. On the opposite side, with the Russians, there was a real fear that the huge size of the Chinese army and Chinese manpower meant that if they penetrated into Russia, they could sweep across the Russian steppe. So both are afraid and concerned about fighting this war long term, and so it doesn't. It's only a very brief war, but it's a sign of how bad relationships have become. And you start to see throughout the world different left-wing backed groups. One left-wing group that will be backed by China, another left-wing group that will be backed by Russia, competing with each other for prominence. In 1962, President Richard Nixon of the United States announced a stunning diplomatic success in re-establishing relations between China and the United States, who up until this point had refused to acknowledge Communist China as the legitimate government. And many people at the time were concerned about Nixon aligning the United States with a leader like Mao. However, understood in the context of the Cold War at the time, it significantly weakened America's communist opponents by dividing two of the most powerful countries in the world who united together. Chinese manpower, Russian military technology, could severely influence and control the United States. So this was an important diplomatic success for the United States. It was also an important diplomatic success for the Chinese. It meant that more and more Western countries established diplomatic relations with China. These relations with the West were necessary for China to achieve the economic success that would fuel the continued political success of the Chinese Communist Party. After Mao's death in 1976, there was a period of struggle before Deng Xiaoping emerged as the leader of the country and proposed dismantling the communist revolution. From this point onwards, China would be governed as a type of mixed economy, as I explained in the last video. It would remain a country with one political party, not really a whole lot of political freedom at all, and an economy that was controlled to a certain extent by the government, but also permitted a sort of hyper-capitalism that was driven by government intervention. The Chinese government established 4 special economic zones. In these economic zones that were coastal cities, foreign investment was allowed to pour in without government interference. So basically what the Chinese Communist Party said to Western nations was, you want access to cheap China labor markets, that's great, but we don't want you influencing our government. So here are 4 cities along the coast, kind of like back in the colonial era, where there was just a single city where Europeans were allowed to trade in. Here's an area where you can trade with China, you can take advantage of cheap labor and cheap production in China, but you won't have much influence over the rest of the country. And so we can benefit from this foreign capital and foreign investment without having to have it shape our politics. And so this was immensely successful. It meant that China became very wealthy, but the Chinese Communist Party maintained its control over China. Continued unrest against the communists' one-party control of China, especially student riots in Tiananmen Square, led to a government crackdown and the imposition of martial law. And we have this very famous painting of the student protester trying to defy the Chinese tanks. This is increasingly the story, I would suggest to you, of the 20th century. That governments become more and more powerful. Those standing against them have less and less infrastructure that will support them. And so this led to a government crackdown and the imposition of martial law. And so Tiananmen Square is a series of protests that end in the massacre of the protesters by the Chinese army. After this disaster, Deng begins to retire from public life and was replaced by a new generation of leaders, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who continue to encourage the economic policies that had made China successful. The Chinese economy continued to grow at a phenomenal rate. It continued to grow at double digits each year. So typically today we talk about 4% growth in GDP. That's a very high, that's considered a very successful developed economy. So China is booming at this time and overtakes Japan as the world's second largest economy in 2010. So we're seeing economic success in China at the same time as you have the country governed by a pretty totalitarian government where human rights generally are very limited. In 2012, Xi Jinping, the current president of China, gained control and would follow a pattern of consolidating his own political power and beginning to increase China's influence throughout the world. So it's in 2018 where he ends term limits to his own position, and then he seizes control of Hong Kong. This has happened recently, and since then we've seen the growing influence